I might just address some general themes first, because lots of questions are around the wage subsidy and how do we, or what do we do with staff now when we can predict that business is dropping down. So I'll cover those points, and then I will move to the questions that have been emailed through. And thanks everyone for thinking of those. I know, first off, this is a really difficult time. Everything has been moving in such a fast-paced way, and everyone in the various businesses that you're involved in have been trying to deal first off with how do we deal with the practicalities of lockdown. And so it does take a bit of time sometimes before you stop and think, well, how are we supposed to be dealing with staff? Some have just come up for air because there's been so many different logistical issues to deal with. The biggest assistance that has come through has been the wage subsidy. That has changed quite frequently though, as they've further refined the details, including yesterday when I was presenting another Q&A session. At the same time as I was saying one thing, the government was announcing another change yet again. So, it's just the way it rolls. We can all cope with it, can't we? So we just get on with it. So in terms of eligibility, you've probably checked all of this out now in terms of the wage subsidy, but you need to have a 30% decline in actual or predicted revenue. And before you've applied, you need to have taken active steps to try and mitigate the effects of COVID. Some people have worried that they can't use the wage subsidy if they're still operating. You can. It is there to assist businesses to continue to employ people. And in fact, one of the declarations that is being required of employers when they're applying for the subsidy is that you will retain employees for the period that you're receiving the subsidy, and that you will use your best endeavours to pay staff up to 80%. Now, we were left on a massive void last week, but the government has caught up with clarification around what does that mean around that 80%. So they've now said, yes, best endeavours, and we were definitely interpreting best endeavours does not mean you absolutely have to at all costs, because this is having different impacts on different businesses, as we know. So best endeavours to pay 80% of wages, but you do need to at least pay over the full subsidy to the employee if you have claimed for them. But if the employee didn't earn as much of the subsidy, you don't have to pay that full amount over. So we were just, kind of dealing with that with a number of particularly part-time employees where they might do a few hours a week and they weren't quite earning even the part-time subsidy, and were they entitled to a windfall or not, and having to make judgment calls on that. So that's now been clarified. You don't have to pass over the full subsidy if they don't normally earn that much. That's a little bit in the dark as to what you're supposed to do with that, but the general concept being that you receive a lump sum in your bank account and then you use that to keep your staff in work. So for those that have no ability to pay because they are shut down, then it is feasible that you might only be passing on the wage subsidy, and the government has confirmed that that is something that might happen. There are a number of situations where people cannot work as much, and so there's a lot going on at the moment with employers about how to reduce hours, and I'll come to that shortly. Just bearing in mind also, while we're on the wage subsidy, that if the person, a person you've claimed for leaves your employment for any reason, there is a requirement or obligation to pay that back. So that does impact on decisions about redundancies. And to be honest, the wage subsidy has changed the way that we were talking pre-lockdown. There were a lot of conversations about redundancies and reducing staff numbers, but the subsidy has achieved the government's purpose of trying to get employers to hold on to their staff. So if you are looking at reducing numbers, then you're going to need to justify why you can't just hold them on your books. and pay them the wage subsidy, which there are people who can't do that. It's just you're going to have to go through that step of demonstrating that. I said that I would also talk about reduced hours, and really in terms of what are we seeing that employers are doing at the moment. Employers are very seriously looking at what next. So for a lot that involves staff not working full-time and reducing their pay comparatively. So many are saying, well, we've got the wage subsidy, we will top up to 80%, and our staff actually haven't got work to work more than that anyway. That requires a process, so you do need to go through that. We can't do anything about the fact that there is a lockdown and that the lockdown happened very quickly. And there are some employers who are needing to consult retrospectively. And in my view, you are better to do that, i.e. consult late, than to not consult at all, because the risks around that lead into things like personal grievances and things like that, which at this time is not something that any business wants to be dealing with. So there is a process required. It's our general consultation requirement in terms of putting forward a proposal, receiving feedback from the staff before you make a final decision. We have been running some more shorter timeframes for these. I think when we're talking about redundancies, that we will need to try to stick where we can to our more normal timeframes, because that is a more significant impact. And at the moment we're leveraging off the fact that we've had this government announcement which has required employers to act very quickly, and that urgency will dissipate, I think. So that's just some thoughts on that. I'll turn through to the questions that people have sent through. So the first one is from someone who's saying their revenue has not reduced but is fluctuating, but it's below the budget that was set for last year, and can they claim the wage subsidy? Well, as I said, you need to actually have that 30% decline in your actual revenue or predicted revenue. So your budgets aren't going to assist you, your previous budgets, but what will assist you is your forecasts from now. And if you can demonstrate that, you really want to think, what objective information have I got to demonstrate this? There is the ability to audit. The extent to which that will happen, we're not sure. So we recommend that you have objective information on that. So you might find that your forecasting from now might demonstrate that. We're certainly finding even those in essential services are showing a downturn in their business. So they're having to deal with that as well. So there doesn't seem to be many or any businesses, maybe supermarkets excluded, who are not feeling this, although anecdotal information is that perhaps we aren't all rushing to the supermarket as quick as we once were. Next question, if we claimed and got it wrong and got some new customers on board that lifted revenue, what would the consequences be in terms of the wage subsidy? Well, that would be quite good really, wouldn't it, if our predictions are not as bad as what we are all forecasting. Look, it is based on the situation at the time of the declaration, and what I have noticed over the last period is that things have changed so quickly. So what you might say is the case one day is quite different the next, and it has been as quick as that. Now things might slow down a bit, but I think you need to, it needs to be true at the time of declaration. But if you do get customers on board later, well, you know, maybe it was the wage subsidy that actually assisted you to do that. The government's operating on a good faith system. So as I said, there is this auditing system. But I think there's a difference between an employer who applied for the subsidy in reliance on a forecasted downturn that's genuine and someone who is scamming the system. So just make sure that you're not misrepresenting the situation at the time of your declarations. There's a question about what other relief is there to meet the difference between the subsidy and the actual weekly wages. The other point I should have said is that I will rephrase some of these questions. So I am picking up these questions and saying them slightly differently because I don't want it to be identifiable back to you. So just so that you are aware. So the difference between the subsidy and actual weekly wages, there isn't really in terms of the employment side of things. There are some other government packages, and if you satisfy those, things like the Business Finance Guarantee Scheme, which is about lending rates. But I think what your remedy is in terms of the employment side of things, if you can't meet the actual weekly wages, then you're going to need to look at whether you reduce the pay to your staff, and whether you know, that might be 80% or it might be less than that amount. The general range that we are seeing is that it ranges between just passing on the subsidy, and I have to say that that's people who can't operate at all, through to 80% is very, very common at the moment. But what I would caution you against is paying them less than what they're working. So if you've got staff working full time, then you're going to have to make a distinction between two groups, perhaps, and everyone's kind of got different groups within their workforce. It's going to be a hard ask to get someone to work full time and take 80%. Another question, is there a recommendation that we pay only 80% or should we be paying in full, as this could physically break some business? So that's similar to what I've just answered there. So you are required to make best efforts or best endeavours to pay that 80%, but as I said, the priority or the reason for this wage subsidy is for people to keep employees employed for as long as possible. And they are achieving that, even if you can only pass on the wage subsidy. So that's your litmus test, I think. You're better to keep people on with what you can afford to pay and go through the relevant process than to try and pay them 100% and jeopardise your business. The next question is around consultation and reduced hours and whether there's any comeback on this. So this person has consulted to go down to 4 days. They haven't given the notice period in the employment agreement. It was the alternative to redundancy, and you know, if they later get upset, does this employee have legal recourse? Well, the short answer is that any employee can raise a personal grievance, and we frequently see personal grievances even without merit. So that is always a risk, and it hasn't gone away. So employment law hasn't been suspended. So for that reason, we need to follow the processes that I've been talking about, but also it means, unfortunately, they can raise personal grievances. And that is why we have to follow the processes. But if this person has been through a process of consultation and has got the agreement of the employee, then the risks of that personal grievance being successful are reduced. There are also a number of employment agreements that have pandemic clauses in them. And where we have those, they are certainly much you've got more clout in reducing hours, because if you take the clauses that we would normally draft, they allow for you to suspend the employee's services for a period of time when affected by pandemic in this case, and also your requirement to pay them wages. So when you are then offering reduced hours, you are offering a better alternative to what you can do contractually under your employment agreement. And so that is quite good leverage. So it's really good to check your employment agreements as well. So someone has asked, said they'd like to know the process for implementing pay cuts and redundancies in the current climate. So As I said before, it is this consultation process. So where we have a pandemic clause, as I just said, we can rely on that and say, well, this is what we could do, but actually we're choosing to apply for the wage subsidy and to try to make efforts to pay you X amount. You need to put it forward as a proposal, give them some time to give their feedback. Feedback at the moment is not going to be face-to-face, obviously. We've all discovered this wonderful world of Zoom and Skype and everything else, and lots of people have FaceTime on their phones, so you can use that. You can use written feedback, you can use telephone. So, you know, just use all of the services that we're all using to communicate with us, each other, to receive your feedback from your staff, and then you'll need to make a decision. And so you need to do that for reducing hours. If you're going to be making someone redundant, you should then have that additional overlay of why is it that we need to make people redundant rather than keeping them on and just paying them the wage subsidy. And that's because of the way that the government set up that subsidy. And look, there are lots of employers that I am speaking to who say, look, this lockdown is going to end whenever, you know, it could be extended too. But this is going to be the result on our business, or we're not going to build up as quickly. I think we all have to assume that business will be slow to pick up because everyone's customers are affected as well. So that might justify a new slimline model moving forward. I think the timing of a redundancy needs to be discussed, and we're having those discussions with people now about weighing up when the appropriate time is and how we interlace that with the subsidy and the obligations under that. Another employer has said that they have announced that they are paying 80% of wages and will apply for the subsidy, but they have had little or no consultation with the employees and what their exposure is. So that is similar to what I've outlined sort of in bits and pieces over other questions. What I would suggest there, so you can't unilaterally impose changes, but what I would suggest is now consulting. So there is always a way to patch up the process, and that so consultation should happen now, I would suggest, and just dealing with it in that same way. We can pick up the previous correspondence that's been had, and we can you know, repackage that as, you know, we've shared our thinking with you, those types of things, and we can fix it. And there will be still a risk there, but at least overlaying it with that consultation. And really, in the environment that we have had, employers haven't been able to tackle all things all at once. Another question about moving to the future and suspending employees and continuing to pay them the subsidy, what process needs to be followed? So that is effectively what we're doing when I'm talking about just paying people the wage subsidy. So you are, in those situations, staff would be doing no to little work, I would suggest, unless you're talking about minimum wage employees, because the subsidy is roughly 80% of a minimum wage for a week. So suspension, so if you've got a pandemic clause, once again, that's where this comes in useful, and you need to follow that same process of consultation. And then you would be proposing that you are only going to pass on the subsidy to them and justifying the reasons for that. Now, what we are doing, what I'm saying to people around these measures that they're deciding what to do is try and think of it in blocks of time. So think of it through to the end of the lockdown, or and think of the lockdown as being a variable date as well, because we just don't know if we're all going to be let out of our little bubbles or not come 22 April. So have a think about what you can do for a chunk of time, and then we consult on the whole package. Some are saying we can pay 80% for 2 weeks, but after that we can't. Others are saying we can pay 80% for the 4 weeks, but if the lockdown extends and we've got no more business, it'll be down to wage subsidy only. So those are the types of things that other businesses are doing. And I would suggest that, you know, we consult about a period of time, and then we will need to go back and consult again. So we want to reduce how many times we're going back to staff. That's just extra admin, extra cost for a business that's already trying to work its way through the various issues that are going on. So that's what I would suggest there. Next question, we're getting mixed messages from the government about redundancies. Can we or can't we do that? So it comes down to some of the stuff that I've already said. So the government's package has made it more difficult to make staff redundant. But if you can justify why you can't keep the staff on the wage subsidy only, then you can go ahead. You have committed at the time of making the declaration that you, for the wage subsidy, that you would keep staff on or use best endeavours. So you need to, you know, objectively be able to demonstrate, should you be asked, what's changed. And probably what has changed is that you have had an opportunity to sit down and consider the impacts. So it is something that can be done. And then, as I said before, the timing is something that we need to look at in terms of manoeuvring around those subsidy requirements. Next question, can we pay statutory holidays on reduced rates where we've got a temporary wage decrease in place? Yes. So if you have been through the process of already reducing staff pay prior to, say, Easter, which is the obvious one coming up, then you can just pay those public holidays at the reduced rate. So another question about reducing hours. Yeah, so this was a question of whether the normal process applies for reducing hours. Some organisations reduced to 80% from day one, and what's the view on that? Look, there's a few questions. I know that there was another one in there too about being an immediate response from the employer. If the employer has done that without a process, then I'd suggest that the employer now undertakes that process. And look, there could be some other views that they've now obtained or formed in their minds since then, and that would be the opportunity to share it with staff. So someone said if they had to make redundancies while they are in lockdown, how would best practice? I've now got a child walking into the room who was not supposed to be here. Please disappear. So yeah, it's best just to be honest about these things, I think, and to pretend, like the video with the man, people crawling in while he was on the teleconference from years ago. So if worst case we had to make redundancies while in lockdown, how would best practice look? So yeah, I think I've probably addressed that. It involved putting a proposal to employees, receiving the feedback, and then deciding whether or not to go ahead with that, keeping in the extra justification I've talked about, and also making sure that the timeframes are reasonable given the severity of what you're proposing there. Another question, what do we need to be doing to consult or formally amending, do we need to be consulting or formally amending contracted work conditions with employees who are working full-time from home in a non-essential business? No, not necessarily. So I think if they're working as per usual, but the only difference is that they're working from home, you've probably communicated that in some form anyway. And so that I think you're fine not to have a formal variation to that. If you did, then that would be good. But it's come about by government direction. So I think we're well covered on that. If it starts to impact on how much work they've got to do, so there's quite a few that are still operating, but their hours are starting to drop, or they've had tail end work, and some are starting to say to me, well, not sure how the next couple of weeks are going to go here, then you might be looking at reduced hours and then dipping into those processes I've talked about. It's a question about employers asking people to reduce their salary but not their working hours. So that would be a pay cut. And look, I think I touched on this before. So you can agree to a reduction in pay. I think it would be a pretty hard sell. And I think you would need to have written agreement, absolutely, in that case. I know that this is happening a bit with senior managers in organisations where they're saying, oh, look, and you've seen it in the news as well, that, you know, the manager is, or CEO is taking a pay cut to help the company get through it. Often there's arrangements in there about making good later on. So it's just, I think if you run on the theory that if you're reducing pay, then reducing hours, you're safer in that environment. I think that would be the better way to go. Trying to, some of them are repetitive, and I am conscious that some of them are very similar. If you've applied for the subsidy but still need to disestablish positions because money's run out, they're talking about still paying out the weekly subsidy, the wage subsidy to impacted individuals for the 12-week period, and also whether the employer can have them do other work during that time, because obviously their job, there's nothing to do. So there's two prongs to that, really. Yeah, some are looking at redundancies, but keeping the staff on almost in an extended notice period, receiving the wage subsidy. That time will tell whether that's considered to be a little bit of an exploitation of the wage subsidy. So I think care is needed around that. If you have got a period of notice with people being made redundant, then you probably can get them to do other work to fill in the time. Usually, most employment agreements will have a clause in there that we can get you to do any other work that we decide. There's a limit to that, and if you're substantially changing someone's role, then you need to go through a restructure. But for something like this, I think if you're keeping someone in employment because what they would normally do is prevented from occurring, then I think you're going to be okay on that. And look, just, you know, cover yourself, have the conversation, say, well, you know, I'm suggesting that you could do this, that, and the next thing. And what we're finding is that most staff members are quite willing to prove their worth because they understand that this could impact on their job. And if they don't show a willingness, then they might be the first off. And I know that's not the case for all, because we are seeing some problematic staff members. But generally, I think, you know, there's that really good contribution, and we're all in there to try and sort it out. So, yeah, so you can do that, and I think you probably should find some other things for people to do. So I think we've just hit our half hour. There's a couple of other questions there. One, are we able to offer a fixed term contract to someone who's replacing an essential employee who's in isolation and can't work? Yes, yeah, you could, and that would be a really good use. So just make sure that your fixed term reasons are properly drafted so that you can bring that employment of that person to an end. It may be that actually you don't need to. I think most employers are finding that they've got a bit of surplus staff, and so you might not need to, but if you do, that's a good problem to have. And a fixed term agreement would be quite appropriate. And you'd need to get some clarity about how long that person who's being replaced is going to be away. So those are most of the questions. If you've got any particular questions or any further questions, please feel free to get in touch. Everything's quickly changing, so we are keeping on top of it, and we're also spending a lot of time as a bit of a sounding board or just helping to talk through the issues and work out where are we best to go. There's lots of HR managers out there that we're supporting as well in terms of brainstorming and getting them on the right, getting everyone on the right track, because it's quite an unusual situation. So it's really worth working out how you best to approach these things, and everyone's got their own particular nuances within their own business, which seem to unfortunately impact on how we do things. So feel free to be in touch. We've got a decent sized team there ready to help everyone. All our contact details are on the website, and hopefully you've got something useful out of today's session and answered questions. So thanks for your time.